There's a certain kind of person almost everyone knows. They show up to the party, they laugh, they take part in conversations, sometimes they even let someone else snap a photo of them. But when it comes time to post it, they hesitate. The photo sits in their camera roll, maybe shared privately with one or two friends, but it never makes it to a public feed. To the outside world, this can look like shyness or arrogance or even secrecy. But the real explanation is usually much simpler and much more human than any of those labels suggest. To understand this behavior, it helps to start with a basic idea from psychology called self-presentation theory. Every time a person decides what to share publicly, they are making a small decision about how they want to be seen by others. For most people who post regularly, this process feels natural, almost automatic. They take a photo, they like how they look or how the moment feels, and they share it without much internal debate. But for people who avoid posting, that same process triggers a kind of internal friction. They start asking questions most people never consciously ask. Does this represent who I actually am? Will people misread this? Is this moment mine to keep, or does it need an audience to be valid? That friction is not a flaw in their thinking. It is simply a more active, more self-aware version of a process everyone goes through, just turned up louder. This connects to something psychologists called public self-consciousness, which is the tendency to be highly aware of how one appears to others. People high in this trait are not necessarily insecure. In fact, many of them are quite confident in private settings. What sets them apart is that they feel the weight of being observed much more intensely than the average person. Imagine two people standing on a stage. One feels the spotlight as energizing, almost like fuel. The other feels it as exposure, like every flaw and every choice is suddenly magnified. Posting a photo online is, in a small but real way, stepping onto a stage. For someone with high public self-consciousness, that stage feels louder and more permanent than it does for others, because the photo does not disappear after the moment passes. It sits there, collecting opinions, comparisons, and judgments indefinitely. Another piece of this puzzle is the psychological concept of locus of control, specifically how much control a person feels they have over how they are perceived. When you post a photo, you lose control the second it goes public. People can screenshot it, comment on it, misinterpret it, or use it in ways you never intended. For people who value control over their image, even subconsciously, this loss of control feels uncomfortable. They would rather keep that control intact by simply not posting than risk having their image used or interpreted in a way they cannot manage. This is not the same as being a control freak. It is closer to the instinct someone has when they prefer texting over calling, because text gives them time to think and calling does not. The desire is not domination, it is predictability. There is also a strong link to this behavior and what is called the spotlight effect, a well-documented bias where people overestimate how much others notice and judge them. Ironically, people who avoid posting photos are often convinced that if they do post, everyone will scrutinize them closely. The psychological research, however, consistently shows the opposite. Most people are so absorbed in their own lives and their own self-image that they spend very little time analyzing someone else's photo. A person might glance at a picture for 2 seconds and move on, yet the person who posted it might believe that same picture was studied and judged for minutes. People who don't post are sometimes more attuned to this bias than they realize. They sense, correctly in some moments, that the value of posting often doesn't match the emotional cost of imagining how it will be received. Then there is the question of identity boundaries, a concept rooted in how people separate their private self from their public self. Some individuals have very thin boundaries between these two selves. What happens in private quickly becomes part of their public narrative, and they feel comfortable with that flow. Other individuals maintain thicker boundaries. For them, private moments are meant to stay private, not because they are ashamed of them, but because they see real value in keeping something just for themselves or for the people who were actually there. Think about a person who reads a poem they love and chooses never to share it widely, not because the poem isn't good, but because something about keeping it close makes it feel more meaningful. The same logic can apply to a vacation photo, a birthday dinner, or a quiet morning in nature. The experience does not need validation to feel complete. This brings up an important contrast between two systems many psychologists describe when talking about motivation. Intrinsic motivation comes from internal satisfaction, doing something because it feels good or meaningful on its own. Extrinsic motivation comes from external rewards, like likes, comments, or social approval. Posting photos taps heavily into extrinsic motivation systems in the brain, especially the same reward circuits activated by small wins or social recognition. People who avoid posting are often, consciously or not, protecting their experiences from becoming tied to that external reward loop. They have noticed, sometimes through direct experience, that once a moment becomes content, the focus can subtly shift from enjoying the moment to performing it for an audience. By not posting, they keep the experience anchored to intrinsic enjoyment, rather than risking it becoming dependent on outside validation. It is also worth mentioning attachment style, since research has shown some correlation between how people form relationships and how they manage social visibility. People with more avoidant attachment tendencies often value independence and self-sufficiency, and they may feel uneasy with too much exposure or dependence on others' opinions. This does not mean every person who avoids posting has an avoidant attachment style. It simply means that for some, the instinct to stay private aligns with a broader pattern of preferring emotional self-reliance over needing external reassurance. They might be the same person who finds it hard to ask for help, or who prefers solving problems quietly before bringing them to others. Their relationship with photos becomes one small reflection of a much larger pattern in how they relate to people in general. Cultural and personal history also shape this behavior in ways that are easy to overlook. Someone who grew up in an environment where personal information was tightly guarded, whether due to family culture, past experiences with bullying, or even professional reasons like working in law enforcement or therapy, often carries that caution into adulthood. Their hesitation to post is not random. It is the product of lived experience, teaching them that visibility carries risk. A teacher who was once harassed online after a student found her personal account will think twice before posting again, not because she is paranoid, but because she learned a real lesson about consequences. Finally, it helps to recognize that not posting is not the opposite of confidence, and posting is not proof of insecurity. Both behaviors can come from healthy or unhealthy places, depending on the person and their reasons. Someone might avoid posting because they have a deep, secure sense of self that doesn't need external confirmation. Someone else might avoid posting because they fear judgment so much that they hide entirely. The behavior looks the same on the surface, but the psychology underneath is completely different. The real insight is not that quiet people online are hiding something, but that they are making a different calculation about what is worth sharing and what is worth protecting. In a world where so much of life is broadcast, choosing not to broadcast can be just as intentional and just as psychologically meaningful as choosing to share.